Good evening, everyone. Or afternoon. Welcome to week number 7 for PPA 500. This is our last Tuesday evening Zoom session together. So we just have tonight's session where we'll cover managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. Then next Tuesday, we will not need to have a Zoom class. Instead, you just spend that time getting your final assessment ready to submit, and that final assessment is then due by midnight next Tuesday, March the 10th. And that is then your final assignment for the class. Once those final assessments come in next Tuesday, I'll spend a day or two working on those, getting those returned to you. Then I'll be ready to input your final grades for the course probably by Friday of next week, as long as the university cooperates. Sometimes they kind of forget to open up the grading rosters for these 8-week courses. It's as simple as just an email. I'll send them an email, tell them to open it up, and hopefully have all your grades in the system no later than next Friday. You are then done with PPA 500, and if you have a second half hybrid course, you can move onward and upward to that second half hybrid course. If you don't have another course scheduled for the second half, then you can just have a restful second half of your semester. That's why these courses are so accelerated and why we put all this information together into 8 weeks just to try and assist with your scheduling flexibility. So final assessment due next Tuesday, no later than midnight. So what we have left to cover then, so that you'll have all the information you need to do a great job on all 5 of those scenarios on the final assessment, is information on the 2 last functions of public administration that we cover here in 500, managing human resources, which will then give you the foundational information you need to then be successful in PPA 577, managing human resources. We'll do that in the first half of class tonight. Then we'll take a break, and then the second half of class, we will look at managing fiscal resources, and that will give you the foundational information you need to be successful then in PPA 555, public budgeting and finance. And once we finish that information tonight, then I think we've accomplished our purposes for this class. We will have introduced you to the discipline and the study of public administration. We also have introduced you to the core content areas in the MPA program and provide you enough information to hopefully allow you to then be successful as you move forward through the remainder of your courses in the program. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our discussion of the function of managing human resources. And if any of you are involved in HR in your organizations, then you're probably familiar with the fact that human resources will consume usually about anywhere from 85 to 90% of most public budgets. So clearly, if we're devoting 85 to 90% of the money in our organizations to any type of function, that function must be extremely important. And that's why managing human resources is a very important function of all public administrators. Now, managing human resources, it is a core course in just about any MPA program that you're going to run into. When I first started my full-time teaching career back in Illinois, one of the first courses I had to teach was called Public Personnel Management. And again, this was back in the Stone Ages. And so back then we called it Public Personnel Management. One of the first things I did when I took over that course was to put in a curriculum proposal to change the title of the course from Public Personnel Management to Human Resources Management. Because the way in which we manage people today is much more along the lines of human resource management theory. People that we've learned about earlier this semester, people like Douglas McGregor, Chris Ardress. It's a much more HRM type of focus, and I think that better reflects in a title such as Human Resource Management. The PPA 577 course you take in our program is titled Human Resource Management. But before we get into some of the discrete functions that you'll engage in managing human resources in public organizations, a good starting point is to talk a bit about public employment and where our current system of public employment came from, how we've gone through an evolution in terms of the criteria we use to determine who qualifies to be a bureaucrat, who qualifies to be a public administrator. So, beginning with the founding of the nation, so all the way back in the late 1780s, we began our first era of public employment, and that era was known as the era of gentlemen. The era of gentlemen was called the era of gentlemen because people who were hired to work for the federal government were people who came from, for lack of a better term, the upper crust of society. These were respected people in society. These were individuals who came from notable family backgrounds. So they were in the right, quote unquote, right social circles. They went to the most prestigious educational institutions. And again, back then, there weren't a whole lot of educational institutions, but they went to the best educational institutions. And so they were termed these gentlemen. So basically, in the era of gentlemen, when we were hiring people to work in the federal level, we were hiring them based upon who they were and based upon their position in society. So that era runs from late 1780s up until the 1820s. The whole purpose of hiring these quote unquote gentlemen, these people from the upper level of society, was for the purpose of trying to legitimize this new national government. So every morning we get out of bed and we don't really think twice about the national government being there. We just assume it's permanent, it's going to be there from day to day, month to month, and year to year. If you were living obviously in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, that was certainly not a given. It was a fledgling government. It was a government that we still had questions about among anti-federalists in several of our states. We had new states being admitted to the Union in the early 1800s, and so the nation was kind of in flux in that regard. We still had the slave, non-slave state type of conflict that was going on. We were invaded by England with the War of 1812, and we saw our capital and our buildings being burned. So there were a lot of questions about whether or not this national government was legitimate, and hiring these people would hopefully add that legitimacy to public perception of this new fledgling national government. However, as oftentimes happens in public policy, we had a triggering event that occurred. And that triggering event that occurred in 1824. So when we talked about public policy, we talked about John Kingdon's policy stream convergence model in terms of how issues get onto a formal decision-making agenda. We talked about garbage can model decision making and how triggering events can open up this choice opportunity, this policy window in which we will make changes to policy. In 1824, we had this presidential election that came to be known as the corrupt bargain. And if you remember back to your American history courses, you know that in 1824, we had multiple candidates running for the office of president. Three of the most notable of those candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. Now, there are others, but those are your three most notable candidates. But we also know whenever you have multiple candidates running for the presidency, it makes it more difficult for one single candidate to win a majority of votes in the Electoral College. And from our reading of the Constitution, we know that in order to be elected president, you need to win a majority of Electoral College votes. So since we have all these candidates running, Andrew Jackson won more popular votes than anyone else, and Andrew Jackson also won more electoral college votes than anyone else. But he did not achieve a majority of votes in the electoral college. From our reading of the Constitution, we also know that if no one gets a majority of the votes in the electoral college, then the presidential election goes into the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is then charged with selecting one of those top candidates. So the election in 1824 went into the House of Representatives. The Constitution tells us that whenever the House of Representatives has to select a president because no one's gotten a majority of the Electoral College, each congressional delegation votes as one. So every state gets one vote, irrespective of the size of your congressional delegation. So if we had a situation today where we'll say in the election of 2028, that it gets thrown into the House of Representatives. The state of Montana or we'll do Wyoming. That's a better example. The state of Wyoming, which is the least populated state in the Union, has around what about 500 and some thousand people. They have one representative in the House of Representatives. That one representative would have one vote. The state of California that has 53 representatives, all 53 of those would only have one total vote. So there's one vote from California and there'll be one vote from Wyoming. That's how the process is supposed to work. So back in 1824, when the election went in the House of Representatives, you had the reason why it's called the corrupt bargain is you had an alleged agreement that was formed between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay that if Henry Clay would get his supporters in the House of Representatives to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams, then once the House selects John Quincy Adams as president, one of the first things that Adams would do would be to appoint Henry Clay to a cabinet position. Now, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay at the time denied any knowledge of an agreement such as that, but it worked in that the House then selected John Quincy Adams to be the president, even though he didn't receive as many popular or electoral votes as Andrew Jackson. And once John Quincy Adams became president, one of the first things he did is he appointed Henry Clay to his cabinet as his Secretary of State. That corrupt bargain led to an outcry among members of the public and especially among Andrew Jackson and his supporters. 4 years later, in 1828, we had a rematch, this time between John Quincy Adams again and Andrew Jackson. And in 1828, Andrew Jackson wins handily. He wins both in the popular vote as well as winning a majority of the Electoral College. When Andrew Jackson assumes the presidency in 1829, he brings with him a different view of who should be doing the work of government. He felt that the work of government did not need to be done by these quote unquote gentlemen, but could and should be done by average, ordinary Americans. And so there are a lot of famous stories about the party that Andrew Jackson held at the White House for his inauguration and how they essentially destroyed the place because they had a huge bash for his inauguration. And he really did believe in bringing average, ordinary Americans into the federal bureaucracy. Andrew Jackson also believed in parties, political parties. And he believed in what we call partisanship, or what came to be known as the era of spoils. So in the era of patronage, the era of spoils, when you believe in partisanship, you believe that to the victor go the spoils. And so whomever wins the election, whatever political party wins the election, they should then have at their disposal all these positions in the federal bureaucracy that they could use as rewards to the people who supported them. We had mentioned when we talked about ethics and accountability, George Washington Plunkett and his memoir, Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And George Washington Plunkett, who was living in the latter part of the era of spoils, so a few decades ahead, made the argument that if he was going to give advice to a young person, at that time he would say a young man, about their future, he would advise them not to go to college. It says, don't go to college and fill your head with a lot of college rot, as he referred to it. Instead, go out there and learn how to get somebody elected. Go out there and learn how to run a campaign, learn how to round up votes, and your ability to round up votes is then the criterion that will be used for then giving you a job in government. So that was the quickest and the most efficient way of getting a job in the bureaucracy, was to support the right candidate and support the right political party. So with the advent of Andrew Jackson, we then have our second era, which is the era of spoils, sometimes called the era of patronage. So here, instead of hiring people to work in the federal government based upon who they are, we are instead hiring them based upon who they know. So did you support the right party? Did you support the winning candidate? So those are the folks that we are then hiring to work in the federal bureaucracy. I like to say that the skills it takes for someone to get elected to public office that's not the same skill set that is required to govern effectively. Those are two different skill sets. And we saw that as a glaring problem throughout the 1800s. We were hiring these people because they were good at getting people elected and winning elections. They were not necessarily good at doing the everyday, what Woodrow Wilson would call business of government. They weren't good at administration. So we had a lot of malfeasance, a lot of misfeasance. We had a lot of corruption, a lot of waste, a lot of inefficiency. And all those things really plagued the bureaucracy, not only at the federal level, but also at the state and local level with all these political machines throughout most of the middle of the 1800s. So, because of all this corruption and all this malfeasance and all this inefficiency, for many years throughout the mid 1800s, to the 1850s and the 1860s, we saw a lot of these municipal leagues at the local level starting their movement toward reform and starting to try and reform this era of spoils, to start trying to hire people based upon their skills as opposed to which political party they supported. So that's kind of that undercurrent that was going on at the state and the local level through these municipal leagues. However, no major change came to the policy of how we hire people, especially at the federal level, until we once again have another triggering event. The big triggering event that made us move away from the era of spoils and move more toward what we call the era of merit, hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, came with the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881. So Garfield, when he received his party's nomination in the election of 1880, kind of came from nowhere. He was a Congress member from the state of Ohio. At that time, where he lived in Ohio was a rural part of Ohio. Now it's a lot more urban, but it was a rural part of Ohio. Lived on a farm. Didn't really like to participate a lot in national politics. Liked to get back to Ohio and go home as quickly as he could. At the convention, Garfield gave a speech to nominate someone else to be a candidate for president for the party. The person he was nominating really didn't have much of a chance, but the speech that Garfield gave was a rousing enough speech that he started to gain some support on the convention floor. And the convention was very much of a broker convention in that we had a lot of different candidates, and the support among the delegates was really split between those candidates. Um, Roscoe Conklin was another one of those candidates who a lot of people thought would end up getting the nomination. But at the end of the day, the kind of groundswell support for James Garfield ended up getting him that nomination. So he gets the nomination of his party. He wins the election of 1880 and then goes into the White House in 1881. Not long after he assumed the presidency, he was then assassinated, and he was assassinated by a disgruntled seeker by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. And if you're interested in this story of the assassination of James Garfield by Charles Guiteau, there was a great miniseries that was released last year. It's called Death by Lightning. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in it. It's a really good miniseries, and it really kind of it dramatizes it a bit, but kind of shows you what happened in this assassination of James Garfield. Charles J. Guiteau was an enigmatic, very unusual type of person. He had a multitude of different jobs in his lifetime. At one time, he was a preacher. At one time, he was an office seeker. At another time, he wanted to be a soldier. Another time, he wanted to be an author. And so he had all these different things that he kept trying, and for the most part, failed at all of them. He had a chance meeting with James Garfield at the nominating convention in 1880. It literally was just meeting him as Garfield was leaving the building, shaking hands with him. That was about the extent of it. But he became enamored with James Garfield and started writing political speeches, campaign speeches for the Garfield campaign, and sent them off to the Garfield campaign. The problem is that Guiteau felt that this is the era of spoils. And so once Garfield got elected president, Guiteau, in his relatively irrational mind, thought, I wrote these speeches for Garfield. I helped him get elected. And so therefore, it's the era of spoils. I should then be rewarded with a job. And the job he wanted to be rewarded with was ambassador to France. Well, obviously, Garfield becomes president. Guiteau doesn't get any appointment. Got and we're not really clear if this actually happened, but supposedly got one meeting in the White House with Garfield. Because one of the things Garfield wanted to do when he became president is be kind of a president of the people. And so he literally had open office hours in the White House. There's a different time period, obviously. And he would literally just open the White House up to people to come and he would meet with them for like 5 minute periods of time throughout the entire day, would spend 10 hours a day just meeting with people. That ended relatively quickly when Garfield saw that it just wasn't realistic because he was overwhelmed with these meetings. But Guiteau was a big believer in Garfield and really actually, if we believe the story, got to meet Garfield. But Guiteau wanted this position from Garfield. Obviously, Garfield, there's no evidence Garfield ever read any of these speeches, let alone used any of these campaign speeches. So Guiteau, in his irrationality, we'll call it again, felt that, well, if I assassinate James Garfield, I will, number one, get my name known. And that's one of the things Guiteau always wanted. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted people to know his name. And it didn't work as an author. It didn't work as a preacher. It didn't work as a soldier. So here is his opportunity to get his name known. But secondly, he felt that if he assassinated Garfield, Garfield's vice president, who is Chester Arthur, was an ardent partisan. Chester Arthur was a party enforcer for Roscoe Conklin. He would literally physically rough people up on the streets in order to get them in line with the party. He was the party enforcer. And so Guiteau felt Arthur will give me this position. So he assassinates James Garfield. Guiteau never got a position from Chester Arthur, and in fact, Guiteau ended up being executed as an assassin of President Garfield. But that was the triggering event that galvanized public opinion around the idea that we really need to do away with this era of spoils, and we need a better way of hiring people to work in government. That's what then led to, you see the gentleman on your screen is a member of Congress, George H. Pendleton. And Pendleton, for many years, carried around with him in his suit pocket draft legislation that would eventually become what's known as the Pendleton Act. This Pendleton Act, once passed by Congress and signed by the president, instituted a system of civil service, modeled after the British civil service system that Woodrow Wilson told us all about in his article in 1887. So the Pendleton Act establishes our era of merit, a career civil service system where we hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. They're hired based upon what they know, as opposed to being hired based upon who they knew back in the era of spoils or who they were back in the era of gentlemen. So the Pendleton Act establishes career civil service. And essentially what it does, it not only says we're going to hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, but we are also going to protect those people from political influence, from political discipline and dismissal and reprisal. So we're going to make sure that people not only get their jobs on an apolitical basis based upon their merit, but they also keep their jobs based upon their job performance. They're not going to be able to be fired just because they support a different political party than their supervisor supports. So that creates career civil service with this Pendleton Act. And as we had talked about previously, we talked about Woodrow Wilson, it gave us things like these open and competitive examinations that we could use to then test people to make sure they had the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities. It really creates this whole civil service system. The vast majority of our employees today in the bureaucracy are these career civil servants, hired based upon merit and keep their jobs based upon their performance. The problem was, though, a few decades in, and once we get into the 1930s, we start to realize that we had afforded all these protections to these bureaucrats from political influence, but we didn't really ask for much back from them in terms of remaining politically neutral. So we have these people who are being protected from political influence, using their offices and using their positions and their position resources to go out there and campaign for candidates and campaign for political parties. So obviously, we could not have that. So we ended up then with the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act placed limitations on the political activities of these career civil servants. So you can no longer campaign while on the job. You can no longer use your office or your office resources to campaign for a partisan candidate or for a political party. So we're saying we're going to protect you from politics, but we're also going to require that you stay politically neutral as you do your work as a bureaucrat. After the Federal Hatch Act was passed, we then saw multiple states pass their own what are called Little Hatch Acts. Here in California, we have a Little Hatch Act as well. And our Little Hatch Act requires that state and local employees also must remain politically neutral while they're on their job and do not have the ability to campaign while they're doing their job and with their position's resources. So this is our career civil service system that is running throughout the late 1800s and throughout most of the 1900s. And then you fast forward the story into the 1970s. So by 1978, we were now almost 100 years removed from the passage of the Pendleton Act. We still had our career civil service system, but the problem that we were encountering is a lot of confusion in that bureaucrats didn't really know what they could and what they could not do on the job. They didn't know what was prohibited and what was allowed. They also didn't know what to do if their career civil service protections were being violated. So we end up with this mammoth piece of legislation called the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. And this Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 really establishes our truly modern system of career civil service with a lot of caveats, and I'll talk about those caveats as we discuss it. So in 1978, President Carter signs the Civil Service Reform Act into law. Civil Service Reform Act changes the structure of the career civil service and creates 5 different new organizations. We get what's called OPM, and OPM is the Office of Personnel Management. And the Office of Personnel Management, and I'll type and talk at the same time, was the central clearinghouse for the recruitment and selection of employees into the federal bureaucracy. So the way in which the Office of Personnel Management would work is the office would put together those competitive examinations that would be used to test whether or not people had the skills necessary for this job in the federal bureaucracy. Office of Personnel Management would then administer those examinations. They would score those examinations. Then the top scorers on those examinations would then be placed on an eligibility list. Usually you would take either your top 3 scorers, maybe your top 5 scorers, you put them on an eligibility list, and then transmit that eligibility list to the hiring agency. The agency could then only interview and hire candidates off of that eligibility list provided to them by the Office of Personnel Management. So the Office of Personnel Management, they did all the position advertising. They were very much the central clearinghouse for the entire personnel human resource management function across the entire federal bureaucracy. The Office of Personnel Management is still alive today, and we still have it today. It is an overhead agency of the executive branch. It is much more decentralized now, though. So instead of centralizing everything through OPM with examinations, now we have decentralized the hiring and provided hiring agencies with a lot more discretion in decision making in terms of who they choose to hire in the process they want to go through. But that's what's known as the Office of Personnel Management. Then the second organization that was created is the Merit System Protection Board. I'll type and talk. Merit System Protection Board, otherwise known as the MSPB. So I mentioned one of the reasons why we got this Civil Service Reform Act is that a lot of career civil servants didn't know what to do if they felt their merit principles were being violated. So if they thought they were being demoted or disciplined or had some adverse action taken against them for political rather than performance reasons, what do? Well, this is what they can do. They can take their case to the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board was then charged with receiving these cases, investigating these cases, and then through kind of a quasi-judicial type of function, would then decide whether or not this case had merit, whether or not the employee was correct, that their merit system protections were being violated. If the Merit System Protection Board felt that an employee's protections were being violated, they could then take action against the agency. Action against the agency would usually mean to make the person whole. So if a person had been demoted for political reasons, they would get returned to their position with back pay. If they were denied a promotion because of political reasons, they would be given that promotion and then given the additional pay that they would have gotten if they were gotten that promotion initially, and so on and so on. So it's a very important organization to rectify violations with civil service. Now, here's our first caveat. That was true through up until about the last year and a few months. The current administration, President Trump, fired some of the leaders of the Merit System Protection Board, replaced them with some of his appointees. The Merit System Protection Board also got a huge cut to its staffing and its budget. So the Merit System Protection Board today doesn't quite have the same orientation or the same budget that it used to have 15 months ago. So it's kind of a little different situation in terms of its ability to protect career civil servants. This is all in line with the policy that we saw in that executive order that was promulgated and signed by the president last year, that essentially is meant to try and undo career civil service and take civil service protections away from a large number of federal employees. So federal employees today, it's kind of questionable if they have the Merit System Protection Board to protect their career civil servant types of regulations. In addition to the Merit System Protection Board, the Civil Service Reform Act also created the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel was originally created within the Merit System Protection Board, and as such, it was part of the Merit System Protection Board. The Office of Special Counsel's job was to protect whistleblowers. And we talked about this, and with whistleblowers, we talked about accountability and ethics, but just kind of as a refresher, if a whistleblower in an agency sees merit principles or something unethical happen, merit principles being violated or something unethical happening, that doesn't necessarily involve them directly. If it involves them directly, they would go to the Merit System Protection Board. If it doesn't involve them and they're instead whistleblowers, they would blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. Office of Special Counsel would then do an investigation of this whistleblower's claims, would then render a conclusion about the whistleblower's claims, and then again, could then have the Merit System Protection Board require restitution for whichever individuals who are being negatively affected by this violation of merit principles. In the Whistleblower Act, that again we talked about a couple weeks ago with accountability, the Whistleblower Act pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit System Protection Board and made it its own standalone agency with its own budget and its own staffing levels. Now, last year, we saw the president remove the head of the Office of Special Counsel. The person who was removed from their position, Dellinger, I believe his name was, he then took his case to the courts. He won at the federal district level as saying that this was an unconstitutional exercise of presidential power, made its way up to the Court of Appeals, and then when it did make its way up to the Supreme Court, by the time his case made it to the Supreme Court, his term on the Office of Special Counsel would have already ended. So the Supreme Court basically says, since by the time we got your case, a year later, your term would have already ended, so the issue is moot because you would have been out of a job anyway. And so the case was declared to be moot, and we never really got a decision on the constitutionality of the president removing the head of an independent agency such as the Office of Special Counsel. So the president was then able to put his own person in at the Office of Special Counsel. Also, Special Counsel has lost a lot of its staffing and a lot of its budget, much like the Merit System Protection Board has. So that's what the Office of Special Counsel was intended to do, protect those whistleblowers and whistleblower claims. Then your fourth organization that was created is the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the FLRA, is the organization that is charged with overseeing the collective bargaining and negotiation process between public employee unions and agencies at the federal level of government. The FLRA basically does for public officials in public unions what the National Labor Relations Board does for private sector unions and private sector corporations. So pretty much all federal employees and all federal bargaining units are under the auspices of the Federal Labor Relations Authority, with the exception of the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation, so postal employee unions are under the control of the National Labor Relations Board because they kind of look and act and feel a lot like private corporations. But for the most part, everyone else, their collective bargaining process is under the control of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Well, the same story that we saw with the Merit System Protection Board and the Office of Special Counsel, we can also say here with the Federal Labor Relations Authority. President Trump earlier this year removed the head of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. That person, their term was ending, and their term was ending, I believe, in July of 2000. I don't know if it was this year. I think it was this year. It may have been last year, but their term was ending in July. They were removed, I believe, in February. By the time the case makes its way through the courts, their term would have been over anyway. And so we kind of see a pattern that what the president has been doing is removing these individuals as heads of independent agencies, but doing it a few months before their term would normally end, so that by the time it gets through the courts, it's a moot issue. So we really haven't gotten a clear answer from the courts yet in terms of, does the president have the ability to fire heads of these independent agencies and then replace those people with his own appointees and do it before these terms are over? So we really don't know. The courts haven't really chimed in on it, at least at the highest level, at the Supreme Court level. But today we still have a career civil service system. The question is, how effectively can it function? When you don't have an MSPB or an OSC or FLRA that are there to kind of protect these career civil service protections, sometimes the question is, is it really actually still functioning? We also saw an executive order from the Trump administration that took collective bargaining rights away from over 1 million federal employees. So, according to that executive order, over 1 million federal employees are supposed to not have collective bargaining rights anymore. Again, that's something that's being fought out in the courts, and so we're going to have to see what the courts say about it. Collective bargaining was part of laws that were passed by Congress and signed by previous presidents. So collective bargaining is something that is permitted under law. The question that becomes constitutionally, and we're not answering it here tonight, but what the courts will have to answer is, can the president, under unitary executive theory, get rid of a career civil service system that was created by Congress? So we're kind of in a holding pattern, seeing what all the courts have to say about that. But the Federal Labor Relations Authority was created for the purpose of overseeing the negotiation process between the employee unions and federal agencies. And then the fifth organization that was created is the Senior Executive Service. So the SES stands for the Senior Executive Service. And the Senior Executive Service was created to try and bridge the gap between political appointees at the top of our organizations and then the vast majority of employees throughout the career civil service that populate the vast majority of positions within our organizations. So in our current system of civil service, we have what is called, this is at the federal level, what we call the general schedule. The general schedule is our position classification system for career civil service positions. So after we do our job analysis, We have to do a job evaluation, which we're going to talk more about tonight. Once we do those things and determine where a position should sit on the position classification schedule, we can then assign compensation to those positions. And that's what's called the general schedule. The general schedule technically runs from a low of a general schedule 1 level, a GS1, today runs up to a GS15 and maxes out at GS15. And that's our career civil service general schedule at the federal level. However, before 1978, the general schedule actually ran all the way up to a GS18. So we had three additional levels, 16, 17, and 18. Those top three levels in the general schedule were just a tick below the political appointees who were nominated by the president, many of them then confirmed by the Senate, and those political appointees run the overall operations of the agency in terms of policy directives and things such as that. Then you have all your career civil servants. Well, what we realized is that there was a big gap in terms of what these political appointees were doing and what all the career civil servants were doing in the organization. Political appointees who are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, those folks are there for a very short period of time. For a lot of them, the best case scenario is they're there for all 4 years of a president's term. Then, once that president leaves, they submit their letter of resignation and they are then out of that position. The rest of the people in the organization, all your career civil servants, they are there for a career. So they're there for 25, 30, 35, 40 years. So if a career civil servant did not like the policies of a political appointee, they would just say, we'll sit back and wait because this person's going to be gone soon enough. I'm going to outlast them. So I'll just kind of ignore their policy directives. And it made it difficult for these political appointees to run their organizations. So with the senior executive service, what we did is we took the top three levels of the general schedule, 16, 17, and 18 levels. And those three levels were then put into this new thing called a senior executive service. Senior executive service members would give up some of their career civil service protections. So it was easier to fire or discipline or terminate a senior executive service member. That was the downside. But the upside was if you go into the senior executive service, you then get bonus pay. So if your organization is doing a good job and it's making progress toward achieving its goals, then you will get bonus pay based upon the performance of your organization. So Congress promised these senior executive service members additional pay. Congress reneged on their promise, and the senior executive service members never got that bonus pay because Congress argued that every year we are in a deficit. And since we are in deficit spending, we don't have the money to provide you with that bonus pay. So it was basically Congress did not make good on its promise. A second advantage of being in the senior executive service is it provided those members with more flexibility in terms of moving from one agency to another. So if you wanted to move from the Department of Health and Human Services to the Department of Education, it was a much easier process if you are in the senior executive service. So what it essentially did is you have the very top of our organizations are political appointees. Then at the level just below that, you have the senior executive service. And the senior executive service now occupies new distinctions known as ES1 through ES5 positions. So there's no more GS16 through 18. Those have become ES1 through 5. ES standing for executive service. Then below the senior executive service is where you have the vast majority of your career civil servants, GS15, and then all the way down the position classification system. Now, honestly, even though the system runs down to GS1 at the very bottom, there really aren't a whole lot of positions at the GS1 level. The lowest it really goes is about a GS3. And a GS3 would probably be a summer student intern, a temporary position. That would probably be classified as a GS3. Coming out of an MPA program with maybe 3 or 4 years of administrative experience, you're probably going to be looking at going into career civil service somewhere around about a GS11 or a GS12 type of level. Today, if you are in a GS 13 to 15 level, you can then apply for and get accepted into the Executive Service Academy. And if you complete the Executive Service Academy, it then makes you eligible to ascend into the Senior Executive Service. Jason, go ahead.
Yes, I'm just curious regarding the GS levels. So, I know you said that for somebody who has an MPA, they and with like 3 years of experience in administrative service, they'd be eligible for GS 11. What about someone who like they have the MPA and then they've worked briefly in the public sector, but they've worked mostly in the private sector? Like for example, I work in auto insurance claims.
Mhm. That usually depends on the position, depends upon the federal agency. Usually that is going to count as experience. And so, probably even though the majority of the work was in the private sector, if it's in the similar industry and it's doing a similar type of job on the daily basis, that will probably count as the experience. And you probably will still go in at that same level, GS 11 or GS 12. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So it'll still be at that level. Like, let's say if I want to work for, well, I'm not sure if it's the same for like the state, but like, let's say I wanted to work for like the insurance, like a federal agency or a state agency relevant to insurance, as opposed to one relevant to housing development. I'd be like ranked higher in the insurance one than the housing development. Is that correct?
Most likely, yeah, because it's
Oh,
in
okay.
that same industry as the job you're applying for.
Oh, okay. All right.
Right.
Thank you.
Sure. And so, yeah, we've got this position classification system. We've got this system of career civil service, but today's career civil service system, take out all the changes over the past 15 months and don't consider those right now. But our career civil service system today is really very much of this hybrid approach, in that the very top of our organizations, it looks a little bit more like an era of patronage, an era of spoils, because those leaders of our organizations, those are political appointees, and they are nominated by a partisan office. So that's kind of era of spoils at the very top. But then the remainder of our organizations, those GS 15 and down, that's very much era of merit. And that's very much people getting their job based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. The senior executive service, that's in between those two levels, that is more kind of a hybrid where they've given up a lot of their career civil service protections. So they kind of look a little bit more like a political appointee in terms of being a little bit more at will in terms of their job status. But they still retain some kind of element of being a career employee, in that even though senior executive service members, they're still kind of viewed as being career public employees. So they're kind of in that netherworld in between political appointee at the top and career civil servant through the rest of the remainder of the organization. Obviously, the advantage of a system like that is that you still have your political appointees who can carry out the policy directives of the chief executive of the president, while still having the people on the daily basis working these jobs day in and day out be the ones who have the expertise and the skills to do the jobs effectively and efficiently. The disadvantage, obviously, is that when Congress did not provide the bonus pay to these senior executive service members, it led to a lot of dissatisfaction. Year after year, the federal government would do surveys of the satisfaction levels of SESers. And what they found out, they would always ask them the question, if you were advising a younger employee, would you advise them to join the senior executive service? Usually between 70 and 75% of responses, they would say no, that they would not encourage a younger employee to join the SCS just because of the broken promises that they receive from Congress. But our modern system is very much this hybrid, political appointees at top and vast majority of our positions staffed by career civil servants. Now, again, as I said, over the past 15 months, the whole idea of career civil service at the national level has really been called into question. And so we're kind of watching all these cases ping pong through the federal court system to try and see what the court determines. And eventually they end up at the Supreme Court. That's going to be the big question is, does a president have the constitutional ability to take the career civil service system away since it was created by Congress and signed into law by a previous president? So we're kind of on hold to try and determine that. Now, obviously, that's at the national level. States have their own career civil service systems. The career civil service system here in California, Obviously, it has been much more unchanged than what we've seen at the federal level. And so, our career civil service system, you still have those civil service protections that you've had for many, many years. And that really hasn't changed very much at the state level. We know that when we are managing these human resources, regardless of what level we are working at, that our orientation toward how we manage these resources is much more an HR, HRM type of manifestation as opposed to classic organization theory. So the way in which we manage people today is much more Douglas McGregor, Chris Argyris, as opposed to being more Max Weber and Frederick Taylor. Even though we have a lot of those classical elements in our organizations, I think that we do a much better job today recognizing the theory Y as opposed to the theory X orientation of our employees, as Douglas McGregor would tell us. So, how do we then go about managing these human resources on a daily basis? And we're not going to get into a lot of details here because this is the type of information that you are going to cover in detail in PPA 577. But just with some very broad brushstrokes, what are some of the major functions we engage in as we manage these human resources? Well, obviously, one of the first functions we engage in is recruitment. We know that from our POSCORB and from Luther Gulick, who tells us that that S of POSCORB, staffing, is one of those elemental jobs of any manager, regardless of what sector they are managing in. Graham Allison tells us the same thing. So we know we need to get people in our organization, so we need to engage in recruitment. The recruitment process is obviously different in the public versus the private sector. In the private sector, you are hiring at will employees. At will employees serve at the will of the organization. So you can call someone in for an interview, you can interview them, and you can hire them on the same day in your private corporation. In the public sector, you typically cannot do that. It's a much more gradual, protracted process. When we hire someone here at Cal State Long Beach, we put the position description out there, the vacancy notice out in July. Before that notice can go out, it has to be approved by multiple levels here at the university, including the Office of Equity and Diversity. Then once we get our applicant pool, that applicant pool will usually come in somewhere around August or September. Once we close that applicant pool then also has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity for diversity and make sure it's as representative as possible. Then once that applicant pool has been approved, then we can select our top semifinalists, and usually we'll select about 8 to 10 semifinalists. That semifinalist pool needs to also then be reviewed for diversity. We then conduct our semifinalist interviews, usually somewhere around January. From those semifinalist interviews, all those interview questions that we use, those have to also be approved before we can hold those interviews. Then from that semifinalist pool, we'll then select 3 finalists. Those 3 finalists then have to be approved again to make sure that they are adequately representative of populations. Then we bring those 3 people to campus. We do in-person interviews. Then we're usually ready to make a recommendation for who we want to hire, typically sometime in late February or early March. So, best case scenario, our recruitment process has gone from beginning in July to the actual selection sometime in March. So, there we're looking at multiple months. We're looking at about 7 months from the process from beginning until the end. And that is a pretty typical process in the public sector. Again, that's done for a variety of reasons. One reason to make sure that you are getting the highest qualified candidate because we are hiring people based upon their merit. Secondly, working toward a representative bureaucracy, which is one of the values that underpins public administration. Number 3, working towards social equity, which is yet another one of those goals and values that we focus on in public administration. And so, for all those reasons, when you hire a career civil servant, it's going to be a much longer, much more protracted recruitment process. Second function is then selecting the employee that you want to hire. So, what bases are you going to use to select the employee to hire? As we know, in the past, we used a lot of examinations. Now, we know that those examinations have begun to be replaced by a more holistic review of a candidate's knowledge, skills, and abilities. And the reason why we have moved away from examinations is the issue of validity. A lot of those examinations we used to use at the federal level, the primary examination that was used for a lot of positions was called the PACE exam. It was, I'm going to get this wrong, the Professional and Administrative Competency Exam, I believe is what it was called, and it was PACE. PACE was used for the vast majority of professional and administrative positions at the federal level. The problem with examinations such as that is that, number one, they do have a lot of implicit bias in that the way in which they are designed can really introduce cultural bias into the hiring process. And that's one major problem. Second major problem is that sometimes these exams are not valid predictors of performance on the job. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There is one type of exam validity, and I'm not going to get into too many details here, but there's one type of exam validity known as content validity. Content validity just simply says that the content of the job exam must align with the content of the job itself. So this comes from a very famous court case, Griggs versus Duke Power Company. And in that case, what they had is they had a organization that was using an exam to hire custodians, but they had questions of higher order mathematics on that examination. And those types of exam questions had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual content of being successful in that job. So the content of the exam needs to correlate with the content of the job to have what it is called content validity. And a lot of our examinations did not meet that standard of content validity. Another type of validity is what's known as criterion validity. Criterion validity can be measured in a couple of different ways, but essentially the way in which you measure criterion validity is you look at performance on the exam and compare it to performance on the job. So one way to measure criterion validity is through a predictive approach. So in a predictive approach, what we will do is we will administer the job exam. We'll then score that examination. We'll take our top scores on the exam and our bottom scores on the exam, and we will then bring them into the organization on a probationary basis. You would assume that those who performed well on the exam will also perform well on the job. Those who perform poorly on the exam will perform poorly on the job. And we ask the question, how well does performance on the exam predict performance on the job? Obviously, that can be somewhat expensive because you're hiring people who did not perform well on the exam on a probationary basis. So chances are those people are going to be there for a short period of time. And so you're putting training costs and onboarding costs into an employee that probably will not make it through their probationary period. But it's one way we can test the predictive value of the examination. This idea of predictive validation is something that we looked at with the GRE for our MPA program. And every now and then we talk about, do we need to use a GRE as an entrance requirement for the MPA program? We have always come to the conclusion of no. And we've come to that conclusion because we have found that your academic performance in your last 60 units of your undergraduate degree is a far better predictor of success in a graduate program than performance on a graduate record exam. And that's the reason why we simply do not use the GRE. Every now and then we'll have a NASPA accreditation site visit team that will come and say, hey, why don't you use the GRE? You have all these applications. Why don't you use the GRE? And we tell them because we've done the studies and the GRE is not a good predictor of success in the program. Another variation on a predictive approach to measuring criterion validity is called a concurrent approach. And in concurrent validation, what we will do is we will take our existing employees and we'll take our top performing employees and a sample of our lowest performing employees, and we'll then have them both take this examination. Then those who are performing well on the job hopefully will perform well on the exam. Those who are performing poorly on job will perform poorly on the exam. So you just kind of reverse the logic of a predictive approach with what's called concurrent validation. But again, we understand these exams are not terribly valid. We understand they have a lot of cultural bias built into them. And so, at all levels of government, we have moved away from examinations and moved more to a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Looking at someone's resume, their education, their experience, the skills that they have listed on their resume. Maybe if they have a student learning portfolio like you will have coming out of this program, looking at the types of budget analyses that they have done and policy analyses they've done, those types of things in a much more holistic type of a framework. Some organizations will still use what are called assessment centers, and this is a very costly type of approach. In an assessment center, you will take your top candidates, maybe your top 5 or 6 candidates, and you will then bring them into a simulated work environment, what's called an assessment center. In that assessment center, they will then do some of the type of work that they'll be required to do on a daily basis if hired into the position. And you can evaluate them doing the type of work that they will be doing on a daily basis. Obviously, the problem with that is it's costly. And the second problem with that is, as Elton Mayo would tell us, the Hawthorne effect. When you observe someone's behavior, they are likely to behave differently than if they don't know they are being observed. So if people come into the assessment center, they know that their productivity is being watched. They're probably going to work harder in that assessment center to get the job than perhaps they will on the job once they are hired. So usually we're using a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to hire our new employees. We then bring these employees in, we onboard them, and after we onboard them to the organization, which can be a very costly type of endeavor, we then need to decide about allocating the work. So, our third function of human resource management is work allocation and evaluation. So, in work allocation and evaluation, what we will do is we'll look at every single position within our organization. And for each position in our organization, we will then conduct a job analysis. A job analysis is where we take every position and we deconstruct that position into its component elements. So we take a position, we ask the question, what types of tasks are being done on a daily basis in this job? What percentage of time is being spent doing each one of those tasks? And what types of skills are required in order to do each one of those tasks? So we're really digging down at the granular level to understand exactly what each job does on a daily basis. So a job analysis is a deconstruction of each individual job in isolation. Once we have done a job analysis for each job in our organization, we will then take the results of that job analysis and we will then do what's called a job evaluation. Now, the difference here is in a job evaluation, we then start comparing positions to each other. So we'll take the results of the job analysis for the position of a police chief, and we'll then compare it to the job analysis results for a position such as a patrol officer. And we'll then compare those positions to each other. So we'll look at the types of skills that are required to be a police chief, the amount of responsibility that that police chief has, the type of effort they have to put into different tasks on a daily basis, the working conditions that they need to work under, and then do the same type of thing for the position of a patrol officer. One of the most common and simplest job evaluation approaches is a point factor job evaluation. And we're not going to get into the specifics of doing one here in this class. It's beyond our scope. Hopefully, you'll be able to take a look at that when you get to 577. But in a point factor job evaluation, you would take that police chief position and you would look at all the tasks that are being done on a daily basis. And so, for a police chief, one of their main tasks may be in terms of supervising the entire department. That's one of their tasks. Putting the budget, departmental budget together and managing the budget. That's another task of a police chief. Um, Interfacing and interacting with elected officials. That could be another part of the job, and so on and so on. And what you will then do is for each one of those tasks, you will look at, well, how much skill is required to do those tasks, how much time is spent on each one of those tasks, and then how relatively important is each one of those tasks to the job. You'll then do the same thing for a patrol officer. Now, for a police chief, putting a budget together, that's going to be a primary task of that police chief. That's probably not going to be a task at all for that patrol officer. Supervision, maybe they both do some supervision, but the police chief supervisory level is going to be much higher than what it will be for a patrol officer. Interfacing with politicians, that's something the police chief is going to do much more than the patrol officer. However, in terms of working conditions, the working conditions for the police chief will probably be safer working conditions than the working conditions of the patrol officer, because that patrol officer is out there on the streets on a daily basis. There is more risk of physical harm with the patrol officer position than with the police chief. But essentially, what you do is you take each one of these factors, you assign points to each factor, you get a sum total of points, and then the position that has the largest total from the point factor evaluation, that's the position that goes to the top of your position classification system. So you can then take each of your positions and you can put them in your position classification system based upon the results of this point factor job evaluation. And you will then be able to assign compensation to each one of these positions. So ostensibly, the police chief position is at the top of the classification system. If it's not, it may be exempt, but for our purposes, we'll play along and say it's not an exempt position. So it's at the top of our position classification system. It will have the highest salary. A step one patrol officer may be closer to the bottom of the classification system, so will have one of the lower salaries. So job analysis leads to job evaluation. Job evaluation then leads to our ability to place our positions in a position classification system, kind of like the GS system at the federal level. And then once we've arrayed our positions in the position classification system, we can then award compensation in terms of pay grades. So each of these positions, when they go into the position classification system, will have a pay grade. That will then tell us what the eligible salary is for positions within that line on our position classification system. So it is a very empirical way of us going through and determining who does what on a daily basis, because again, our organizations are based upon division of labor and based upon specialization of task, just like we heard with Max Weber back in the classical school, and will allow us to assign equitable compensation based upon these different positions. Also, the job analysis will then allow us to write a position description. So we'll be able to then use the result of the job analysis to craft a position description that will then tell the incumbent who is in that position, here are the jobs that you'll be doing on a daily basis. Here's the percentage of time that you will be spending on each one of those jobs. If you're working in an organization, chances are your position has a position description, and hopefully you know what your position description is. If you are a unionized employee and you're represented by a part of a bargaining unit, then I'm sure that you know what your position description is, because if you are ever asked to do work that is not in your position description, that could then be the grounds for a grievance against the organization. So a traditional position description takes the results of the job analysis and lists here are the tasks done on a daily basis and the percentage of time spent on those tasks each and every day. That's a traditional position description or a positional job description. A variation on a traditional description is what's called an ROD. And an ROD stands for a results-oriented description. In a results-oriented description, we are going to take it a step beyond, and instead of just listing the tasks that you're doing on a daily basis and the percentage of time that you spend on those tasks, we will then also add in performance indicators for expected levels of performance that you must achieve doing each of those tasks on a daily basis. So to give you an example, let's say you have a job such as a front desk receptionist. That front desk receptionist in their traditional job description may have tasks such as Greeting visitors upon entry into the lobby. And you may spend 20% of your time doing that. You may have a answering phones, and you may spend 40% of your time doing that. Typing correspondence, you may spend 40% of your time doing that. That's a traditional job description. And a results-oriented description will then add on performance expectations. So for greeting visitors once they enter the lobby, one performance expectation may be that you refer visitors to the correct office 100% of the time. That's your performance expectation. Answering the phone, maybe your expectation is you need to answer the phone no later than the second ring using the prescribed script that you need to answer the phone, that you need to address the person when you answer the phone. And maybe in terms of typing correspondence, the amount of words per minute that you have to type, that would be a performance indicator. So putting those performance indicators in a results-oriented description is very helpful because it gives you a leg up on then doing evaluation. So we're always going to want to do performance evaluation, evaluate the performance of the incumbents in these positions. If the incumbents in the position, through their position description, already know what the performance expectations are, then they're likely not to be terribly surprised whenever they get their performance evaluation. One of the major problems with the performance evaluation is that employees don't like being evaluated because they fear what we call cognitive dissonance. Most employees feel that they are doing a very good job on a daily basis. Then they get a performance evaluation that says they're not doing as good of a job as they thought they were. That creates this cognitive dissonance and it makes people fear those performance evaluations. Supervisors oftentimes don't like doing performance evaluations because what we call the fear of playing God, that there are some very important ramifications of getting a negative performance evaluation. It may mean that employee is no longer eligible to join a training academy or be able to go into a leadership position. So supervisors hate to have that negative impact upon their employees. So when you have employees who don't like doing performance evaluation and supervisors who don't like doing it, sometimes it's difficult to get performance evaluations done. One maxim of public administration is that performance evaluations, when you create them, if you create them with the contributions of the person being evaluated, that person will be more likely to accept the results of that evaluation, even if they contain constructive criticism. Going back to Martha Durthick and her argument of if you involve implementers in the design, they're more likely to support the implementation. Same type of thing here. If you include employees in the design of the evaluation, they're much more likely to accept the results of that evaluation. There are different formats we can obviously use for performance evaluations. Our goal is to have an evaluation that provides not just summative information, so a summary of the person's performance, but also an evaluation that provides formative information, formative feedback that can be provided to that employee that will then help that employee improve their performance in the future. So we're going to kind of combine both a summative and a formative approach. The most common type of evaluation is a graphic rating system. That's where you have your like or ordinal categories of strongly agree, neither, disagree, strongly disagree. It's a very quick and easy way of doing a performance evaluation for a supervisor, but again, it's very summative. It doesn't provide that formative feedback to the employee. So the employee knows that, well, yeah, I got an excellent score on this indicator, but I don't really know the difference between that and good. Or I got a good score. I don't know how to get my score up to being excellent because I didn't get that type of formative feedback. To get that formative feedback, you would have to combine a graphic rating system with an essay system, just so you kind of have that normative feedback. The approach that is usually preferred today is a BARS approach. And BARS stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. Behaviorally anchored rating scale. And a behaviorally anchored rating scale, what we are doing is we are providing the behaviors that will lead to a certain type of rating. So it's kind of like you see in a normal grading rubric. So a grade of A, here's the behavior that will lead to a grade of A. So if the paper is well written, if it is insightful, if it introduces new insights to the topic, if it supports the information with APA formatted citations, all those things are behaviors that will lead to a grade of A. Then here are the behaviors that will lead to a grade of B. Maybe all those behaviors, but maybe not developing a new insight, and then so on and so on. So this provides you not just the summative, but it also provides you with the formative approach to providing feedback to your employees. And so a lot of organizations have moved toward this behaviorally anchored rating scale. Based upon those performance evaluations, we sometimes then need to make decisions about discipline and sanctioning. There is a misconception out there that career civil servants cannot be terminated, and that is not true. They can be terminated, but they can only be terminated for cause. They can only be terminated for documented subpar poor performance. So, what we need to do is, as we conduct our performance evaluations, whenever there is subpar performance, we need to document that subpar performance, and then we have to offer training and development opportunities. After the employee has gotten those training and development opportunities, we then reevaluate that person's performance. If that performance is still subpar, then we have to provide more training and development opportunities, then reevaluate the performance, then provide more training and development opportunities, and we need to document that entire process. Disciplining, sanctioning, terminating cannot occur from one subpar performance unless you happen to be on a probationary status. But once you are in the career civil service, any type of discipline must come from the identification of a pattern of subpar performance, followed by training and development, followed by more subpar performance, and so forth, so on and so on. So, in order to discipline and train in the public sector, you have to have a documented pattern of behavior, as opposed to how you can discipline and sanction in the private sector with a purely at will type of employee. And then to kind of wrap up this discussion of managing human resources, we do have to talk about the influence of unionization. I think I've mentioned it in previous classes, but public sector employees tend to be unionized at about 3 times the rate of their private sector counterparts. So, unions and collective bargaining agreements will have a major impact on how we manage our human resources. So, as a manager, when you are managing your human resources, you not only have to be very conversant in career civil service protections, you also have to be conversant in the collective bargaining agreement, the contract between the employee union and the agency. Now, again, we have seen the current administration sign an executive order taking collective bargaining away from a lot of career civil servants, at least according to the executive order. We also, just as of, I think it was the end of last week, the Department of Treasury just put out a memo to all members, all agents in the IRS, telling them that their collective bargaining agreement is now null and void, and saying that the Department of Treasury will no longer abide by the provisions in that agreed upon collective bargaining agreement. There is going to be another legal question that's going to have to be answered by the courts. Can a federal department take away a collective bargaining agreement that it's already agreed to between itself and between the employee union? So there very much are a lot of challenges that are currently being levied against the collective bargaining process, especially at the federal level. Collective bargaining, though, is just this negotiation that goes on between an employee union, their negotiating team, and the negotiating team for an administrative agency. The scope of bargaining speaks to the types of issues that are allowed to be negotiated over. So some states have a very permissive scope of bargaining where they'll allow a lot of issues to be part of the collective bargaining process. We see that kind of here in California and some other states. Some other states have a very restrictive scope of bargaining where they will preclude a lot of issues from the collective bargaining process. We see that in a lot of southern, southeastern states. At the federal level, there is one big issue that is outside of the scope of permissive bargaining, and that is compensation. Now, that sounds strange to us here at the state or local level because compensation tends to be the number one issue that we negotiate over between unions and administration at the state and local level. However, at the federal level, compensation is outside the scope of collective bargaining because compensation is established by Congress. Congress has a commission on compensation. That commission on compensation will then make recommendations to Congress as to whether there should be an increase in federal government compensation, and if so, how much that increase should be. So, since Congress determines compensation, compensation is outside of the scope of collective bargaining at the federal level. Well, when the bargaining unit and the agency are unable to come to an agreement, that is then what is called an impasse. And one or two, or maybe both of the parties can then declare an impasse in bargaining, which means we are unable to come to a negotiated settlement. Whenever an impasse is declared, we have to find some mechanism to try and break up that impasse and get the negotiation process moving again. So, the way in which you can do that, there are three alternative solutions to an impasse in bargaining. One is what's called fact finding. In fact finding, what will happen is one or both of the parties will say, we are at an impasse, we cannot come to a conclusion. So, what they will then do is bring in an outside fact finder, an objective third party. That fact finder will then come in, will then look at all the situation, everything, every aspect of the negotiations that's going on, and will then write up a fact finder report. That fact finder report will not come to any conclusions. It will not recommend a settlement. It will just lay out all the facts of what's going on in this negotiation process. That fact finder report then gets embargoed for a 2 week period of time, meaning that it is not released to the public or the press for at least 2 weeks. During that 2 week period, you then have a situation where the union will be able to review the fact finder report. The administration will be able to review the fact finder report. Hopefully, if that fact finder report makes one or the two parties look bad, they're not going to want to see that report get released to the public. And so it will put some, it'll light a fire, if you will, under one of the parties to try and come to a conclusion so that fact finder report never sees the light of day. That's what's called fact finding. A second way to break up an impasse is called mediation. Here you bring in a third party outside mediator to come down and sit down with both of the parties and try and hammer out a solution. The federal government has an organization called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. The Federal Mediation Conciliation Service contracts with trained mediators that upon request they can then send those mediators out to then go out to these negotiations and try and broker an agreement. My undergraduate institution, one of my political science professors was contracted with by the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service. He was traveling around the country all the time, going and trying to come to conclusions and come to agreements all over the country in these collective bargaining processes. If you really want to come to a conclusion and break an impasse, the way in which you know 100% sure you can do that is through a type of arbitration known as final offer binding arbitration. And this is approach final offer binding arbitration. And final offer binding arbitration is just one approach to arbitration, whereby you'll bring in an outside arbiter that's agreed upon by both the union as well as management. That arbiter will come in and say to the union, let me see your final offer to the management. Management, let me see your final offer to the union. We'll then look at those two offers and we'll select one. The selected offer by the arbiter then becomes the contract. That then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. It is a very high stakes, high reward type of process. If your final offer is the one that's accepted, you love final offer binding arbitration. If yours is not accepted, you hate final offer binding arbitration. But however you do it, that collective bargaining agreement then becomes official and it then works alongside your career civil service protections to provide protections to those people who are represented by that union. Collective bargaining agreements are typically temporary in nature, so they might run 3 years or 5 years in duration. Sometimes you'll have what are called reopeners in a collective bargaining agreement. So maybe the union is not happy with the final salary increase that they're getting. So, in order to make this negotiated settlement work, what they have said is, okay, we will accept this 2% raise, but we want a salary reopener. That means that maybe in 1 or 2 years, we want to go back to the table and negotiate for a higher salary increase. That kind of allows you to accept all the other parts of the agreement and the salary increase temporarily, but then have a chance in a year or two to then try and renegotiate a higher salary increase. At the federal level, this entire collective bargaining process is overseen, as we said, by the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Here in the state of California, our collective bargaining process is overseen by an organization called CalPERB, which is the Public Employee Relations Board. If one party or the other feels that the other party is not negotiating in good faith, or if, for instance, the agency is not allowing the union to organize and create a bargaining unit, they can then take a claim of what's called an unfair labor practice, or ULP, to CalPERB. And CalPERB will investigate it and determine whether or not this truly is an unfair labor practice. So, really quickly, before we take a break, just to kind of wrap this up, I'll give you a couple of examples. So, one example of an unfair labor practice could be that the agency is having people do work that is not listed in their position description and not paying them extra for that work. That would be something the union could say is an unfair labor practice. If management is not willing to collectively bargain over that, they could take their unfair labor practice claim to CalPERB. So that's an example of what could be an unfair labor practice. They can also complain to CalPERB if one of the parties is not engaging in good faith bargaining. Good faith bargaining means that both parties are coming to the negotiation table in good faith. They're both coming to the table for the purpose of trying to come to a resolution that is fair to both parties. One example of bad faith bargaining is something known as regressive bargaining. In regressive bargaining, what will happen is one party will move back off their initial offer. So you'll have the agency that will offer to the union, we're going to offer you a 3% annual salary increase. The union says, well, we're going to counter offer, we want a 5% increase. Management then says, well, you know what? We thought about it. Instead of that 3% we originally offered, we're only going to offer you a 1%. You can't do that. That's regressive bargaining. You cannot make an offer that is worse than a previous offer that you have made. So that would be a bad faith bargaining example. That's something that could also then be grieved up to CalPERB. So essentially what we see here in managing human resources is that it's a very complex function for public administrators. Not only do managers have to be very conversant in the protections afforded to career civil servants, they also have to be very conversant in the protections afforded in the collective bargaining agreement. When you overlay a collective bargaining agreement on top of career civil service protections, it means there's a lot for managers to know in managing their human resources. And because of all those moving parts, the kind of impact of that is we've seen a lot of public agencies centralize their human resource management within a centralized human resource management office. So now we just kind of leave it to the professionals. So there are so many moving parts here. We will just leave all of these HR functions to the HR professionals and take those duties out of the hands of our line managers on a daily basis. Again, this just kind of gives you a little insight into some of the topics that you'll be covering in 577. You'll get into a lot more granular detail, especially in terms of the different functions of human resource management. You'll talk in a lot more detail about unionization and a lot more about what CalPERB does and what the Federal Labor Relations Authority does. This just kind of gives you a little bit of overview from that 30,000 foot level of how we manage human resources and some of the difficulties that we encounter on a daily basis in managing those human resources. I went a little long with that. I apologize. I know we're already hit 5:30 and we are due for our evening break. If we can, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break tonight if we can do that. Come back at 5:40, and when we come back at 5:40, we will then shift into our final topic for PPA 500, and that is this discussion of how we manage fiscal resources. So take a break, come back at 5:40, and we'll do management of fiscal resources. Okay, we are back. It's 5:40, so let's move into our final information for the course, and that is managing financial resources. Give you a little bit of insight into what you'll be covering then when you get into PPA 555, public budgeting and finance. Again, this is just going to be a very brief overview of some of the things we do as we match budgets, and some of the major elements that we have to watch out for as we are managing those budgets as well as we go through budgeting processes. So the first start out with what a budget is. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what a budget is. Typically, a budget is a statement of how much money we're going to spend in the next fiscal year and what we plan on spending that money on. That's a very basic definition of a budget. Whenever I teach budgeting, though, I usually ask people to go beyond that very basic definition and really start to think about a budget as being more than just a statement of dollars and cents, and instead think about a budget as being a statement of societal priorities. Because we always have finite resources and we're faced with infinite demands. Whenever we have to try and fund the infinite demands with finite resources, it obviously means that there's going to be a lot of trade-offs, and we're going to have to prioritize. If this year we're spending more on defense, then we may have to spend less on education. And so, really, a budget is very much that statement of societal priorities. When you define a budget as a statement of priorities, you are then ratcheting up the importance, the significance of that budget document, because it really does give you some insight into what a society values and its what it values over what else. And so I really do think it's very much the statement of priorities. Now, at the state and local level, we tend to utilize two different types of budgets, and we talked about this. We talked about rational, comprehensive decision making versus incrementalism. And those two budgets we use at the local level tend to be what we call operating versus capital budgets. An operating budget is a budget for the daily operations of that organization. So this is how we pay our salary and benefits. This is how we pay for our supplies. This is how we pay for our maintenance. This is how we pay for utilities. And so the operating budget will keep that organization operating on a daily basis. That's the incremental approach to budgeting. The capital budget is for those long lifespan, high priced items that are also non-recurring. So that recreation center, that aquatic center, that city hall, those capital projects tend to be budgeted in a capital budgeting process whereby we're able to spend more time and devote more attention in a more rational decision-making process to whether or not we should fund those projects and how to prioritize those projects. Those capital projects then go into a capital improvement plan. The capital improvement plan will then plan out all these capital projects over typically a 5 to 7 year period of time. The federal government usually doesn't use a separate capital budget just because the size of the federal budget is so immense that a $100 million capital project, if you throw that into the federal budget, it's going to be a pebble going into the ocean. You're not even going to see the ripple effect. However, if you take a $100 million project and you put it into the operating budget of a local city, it's going to blow an immense hole in that city's budget, and the city simply will not be able to avoid a deficit with having that $100 million project in their overall operating budget. So capital budgets are used by state and local governments tend not to be used very much at the federal level. So what's the process of budgeting? How do we in public administration go about putting a budget document together? There are essentially four main phases in the budgeting process. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details here because the federal budgeting process is so complex and convoluted that people who have served in the Senate for decades, such as Mitch McConnell, will admit that they still, despite all those years in the Senate, do not understand every aspect of the federal budgeting process. But the four main phases for any budgeting process, number one, preparation, number two, formulation, the third phase is execution, and the fourth phase is evaluation. Now, to try and illustrate these four phases in the budgeting process, we are going to use the federal level as kind of our touchstone because state and local processes are kind of built after the federal approach. Now, there are major differences between federal and state approaches, but a lot of what we do in terms of our process at the state level, it kind of mirrors this four-phase type of a process. So in preparation is where we decide how much money we are going to have to spend in the next fiscal year. So in preparation, what we will do is we will go out there and we will forecast our revenues. So how much revenue do we anticipate generating next year? And then how much revenue will we need to spend to maintain our current operations? At the federal level, the two main organizations that engage in revenue forecasting are the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB, and that is the arm of the president, and then the Congressional Budget Office, otherwise known as CBO, which is the legislative arm of Congress. So both CBO and OMB will go out there and they'll forecast these revenues to try and determine how much money we have to spend in the next fiscal year. It's important to know that as these organizations go out there and produce their forecasts and their estimates, they use different types of methodologies, which means that they oftentimes come to very different conclusions. OMB oftentimes tends to be a lot more optimistic in terms of the amount of revenue we're going to have to spend. CBO tends to be much more pessimistic. And the reason for that is that OMB serves the president, and so they want to be more optimistic in terms of the amount of money we have to spend so that they can better meet the policy priorities of the president. So this preparation phase is going to start long before the fiscal year. So this is going to start oftentimes a year and a half before the fiscal year begins. And we should mention the fiscal year is different at the federal level as compared to here in the state of California. At the federal level, the fiscal year runs from October 1st until the following September 30th. Here in California, it runs from July 1st to the following June 30th. So we're on two different fiscal years. So preparation is going to occur long before the fiscal year begins. Once we have put together all those forecasts and those estimates, we will then at the national level have the Office of Management and Budget, which will put out its call for budget requests, wherein it will ask all the agencies and departments across the federal bureaucracy to submit their budget requests for the next fiscal year. OMB will then collect all those budget requests, will analyze them, will probably make cuts to each one of those requests, and will then put those revised requests together into the president's executive budget. That budget, once it is created, will then be transmitted to Congress, and that usually happens in February. Once the president's budget goes to Congress, we then move from the preparation phase into the second phase, which is called formulation. The formulation phase is where Congress considers the president's budget. So they'll review the president's budget, they'll make changes to the president's budget. This is formulation. This formulation phase begins in February when Congress receives the president's budget, and technically is supposed to run to the following September 30th and should be done before the beginning of the next federal fiscal year. Now, to save you a lot of the painful details about what Congress does in formulation, suffice to say that when the president's budget goes to Congress, its initial starting point are what are called the budget committees. There's a House Budget Committee and a Senate Budget Committee. The job of the House and the Senate Budget Committees is to pass what is called a concurrent resolution on the budget. Then text shot, concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum amount of money that we can spend across all the different programmatic areas of the budget. The budget is broken up, especially for what we call discretionary spending, into 12 different programmatic areas. So you'll have one programmatic area that will be for education, one that will be for health and human services, one that will be for defense, and so on and so on. And so we'll establish maximum amounts of money that can be spent across all those different programmatic areas, and those maximum amounts are then incorporated within this concurrent resolution on the budget, which needs to be passed no later than April the 15th. Not ironically, tax day. Once that concurrent resolution establishes the maximum amount of money that can be spent, this is where the budget process kind of goes down two different roads. One road is what's known as the discretionary road. There's one type of spending known as discretionary spending. This is spending that Congress has direct control over. This discretionary spending goes down the road known as the appropriations process. In the appropriations process, you'll then have the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee. Each of those committees will have 12 separate subcommittees. Each of those subcommittees will pass out their own appropriation bill. Then the parent appropriation committee will pass the bill, and then that bill goes to the floor of the House or to the floor of the Senate. So discretionary spending goes through an appropriation process through the passage of 12 separate appropriation bills. Then a second type of spending is what's called mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So something like an entitlement program like Social Security. In Social Security, people get Social Security benefits if they are legally entitled to those benefits. Congress cannot spend less on Social Security unless it wants to change the eligibility requirements. So you decide to change the eligibility requirements and make the maximum retirement age 72 years old. If you do that, you then reduce the number of people who are then eligible to get those benefits. By reducing your number of eligible beneficiaries, you in turn then reduce the amount you're spending on Social Security benefits. That's called mandatory spending. That goes through what's called an authorizations process, and that will then go through authorization committees. So we've got these two different things. You've got appropriations for discretionary spending. You have authorizations for mandatory spending. You go through this process. The goal is that by September 30th, the House and the Senate will have passed out 12 appropriation bills, then send those bills on to the president so the president can then sign those bills by the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. Now, that rarely, if ever, happens. And the reason why that doesn't happen is that the process of budgeting has become highly political. And so sometimes we'll get maybe one or two of those bills passed by the House and the Senate and on to the president. Sometimes we'll get three or four of them. We very rarely get all 12. So whenever there is an area of spending, so Department of Homeland Security is the perfect contemporary example. So whenever you don't have an appropriation bill agreed to for the Department of Homeland Security, what will then happen is in order to keep the department operating, you would then have to have Congress pass what is called a CR. A CR stands for a continuing resolution. That continuing resolution will provide a temporary amount of funding just to keep the doors open for maybe 2 or 3 weeks until Congress can hammer out their differences to come up with a permanent appropriation for the Department of Homeland Security. What we have seen is that we had one of these CRs for Department of Homeland Security that expired. We weren't able to come to an agreement over that 2 week period of time. And so now we have a partial shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. So there are some employees in Homeland Security that are furloughed, and so they've been sent home without pay. We have other essential employees who are being forced to work on a daily basis without pay. That's a partial government shutdown. Eventually, especially when you have a partial government shutdown across more than one just one agency, eventually everyone will get tired of the partial government shutdown. There'll be enough political pressure that will cause the House and the Senate to go back to work and take all these unpassed appropriation bills and squish them all together into this Frankenstein piece of legislation that's known as an OBRA. And an OBRA is an omnibus budget Reconciliation Act. Trying to type quickly, so forgive my typos. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Get this in here. Sorry, I misspelled reconciliation. We get the idea. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. This Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act will consist of all those unpassed appropriation bills. And to get people to vote for it, we're going to throw a lot of additional what we call pork in there. So we're going to throw a lot of additional spending in there in order to convince a member of Congress to support the bill if he otherwise or she would otherwise not support it. So we cobble everything together into an OBRA, and that's typically how we pass the federal budget. Once the federal budget is in place, however it's gotten in place, then we move in the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st into the phase known as execution. This is the fiscal year in which we are spending the money. So once the fiscal begins on October 1st, we start spending the money. That's the execution phase. Execution will then run from October 1st until the following September 30th. When that fiscal year expires, we then move into the fourth phase, which is evaluation. We go back and audit the books. We ask the question, did we spend the money in the legally mandated way we were required to spend the money? And then secondly, we'll ask the question, how well did we spend the money? Did we spend the money in a way that will help us to achieve our program and policy goals? So those are basically the four phases of the federal budgeting process. Here in California, we have these phases, but it's a little bit different. So in the preparation phase, we will have the governor prepare their budget. That usually happens in January. The governor will then provide the budget to the state legislature. And once it goes to the state legislature, then you move into formulation. Usually, again, that's around the end of January. The state legislature, though, in formulation, kind of hedges its bets because it's waiting for this magical date in May known as the date of the May revise. And this is something that's unique here in California, but about the middle of May, we will get what's called the May revise. The May revise is a revision to the amount of money that we actually generated as a state. So back in January, when the governor put their budget together, they put that budget together based upon assumptions of how much revenue the state will collect. Once we get to May, we've actually collected those receipts, so we know whether or not our assumptions were correct. Maybe we are collecting less money than we thought we were going to. So in that May revise, the governor will revise their budget downward to try and save money. If our receipts are above what we thought they would be and we're generating more money than we thought, then the governor may go back and revise his budget upward and end up spending more money or maybe putting more money into the state's rainy day fund. But the governor will revise their budget in the middle of May based upon this May revise, and that's where the state legislature really gets to work. Then throughout the rest of May and up until June 15th, they work on the governor's budget. By law, the governor's budget or the budget must be passed by June 15th. The governor then must sign it by June 30th for the beginning of the new state fiscal year on July the 1st. However, even when we have a budget that is signed on July 1st, there is still more work to do here in California. Then what the state legislature will do is it will then work on and pass what are called trailer bills. And again, this is something that's unique to us here in California. These trailer bills are called trailer bills because they trail on after the budget has been passed. And these trailer bills will then lay out the specifics on how this money should be spent throughout the fiscal year. A lot of local governments, I know that my district did this when I was on the board. We are very hesitant to start spending money on July 1st before these trailer bills have been passed. Because if we go out there and just start spending the money willy-nilly, so to speak, then if the trailer bill gets passed maybe a couple weeks later and we have spent the money in a way that's not allowed under the trailer bill, we've got some issues we're going to have to deal with. So a lot of local governments will hold off on doing their spending until these trailer bills are passed so they really have the specifics on exactly how to spend this money. But we here in California tend to not have a problem getting our budgets done on time. We don't have a problem getting our budgets done on time because number one, we have a one-party supermajority in both the Assembly as well as the Senate. Number two, we don't have a problem getting the budget done on time because we only need a simple majority in order to pass a budget. That's a change. In the past, we had to get a two-thirds majority. Now we only need a simple majority. So it has made it very easy for us to pass budgets here in the state of California. But overall, that's kind of the helicopter view of how budgets are put together at the federal level as well as how they're put together here in the state of California. The big caveat here is that you could teach an entire graduate degree program on the federal budget process. It is that complicated and that convoluted. So this is just a very brief overview. You'll get into a lot more details when you get to your 555 course. But what do budgets look like? There are different ways in which we can design our budgets, and these different budget designs are referred to as budget formats. And this is an important piece of information for us here in this class. So, a budget format. So, a budget format is essentially what the budget looks like. The traditional type of budget format is a line item budget format. A line item budget is oftentimes called object of expenditure. And if you've seen a public budget before, you are probably looking at a line item budget. A line item budget will list here is what we're spending the money on, and here is the amount of money we are spending on that item. So salaries, the amount, benefits, the amount, utilities, the amount, and so on and so on. That is a very simple line item budget. Line item budgets are very easy to put together, but they are not very good at providing us with a lot of information. The only information we have is how much we're spending and what we are spending that money on. Alan Schick, as you all know, wrote a very famous article where he compared different budget formats based upon the purpose that we are using those budgets for. And Alan Schick identified three different purposes that you can use a budget for. The first purpose that he identified in his article, that hopefully you had a chance to take a look at, is the purpose of control. Schick says we can use our budget format for the purpose of controlling how much money we're spending and what we're spending the money on. A line item budget format is a good format to help us establish control over the money we are spending. So number one, it's control. But because the line item budget doesn't give us a lot of information about how well we're spending the money, we are not able to use our budget to help us more effectively and efficiently manage the operations of our organization. Schick tells us that the second main purpose of a budget is for the purpose of management, to use it as a managerial tool to help us better manage our organization. If we want to use our budget document for the purpose of management, then we would have to use the second budget format, which is a performance-based budget. So here we are going to start adding on to our line item budget by including measurable performance indicators. So we are going to spend X amount of money on police patrols in a police department. So for those police patrols, the activity we're going to be funding will be X number of hours of police patrols. That's the activity that we are funding. But what do we expect to get from spending this money on these additional hours of police patrol. Well, hopefully, one of the performance indicators is that if we have these additional hours of police patrol, we will be able to reduce our property crime rate by 15%. That is a tangible, measurable performance indicator. Those are the types of indicators you incorporate in your budget when you're using what's called a performance-based budget. It gives you the information you need to then manage the operations of your organization. Now, if you're looking at a local government's budget, chances are you're going to see a simple line item budget. However, there are some governments in Southern California that have combined their line item budget with a performance budgeting approach, where they have started to include some of those performance indicators. So, this is something that you might see at the local level of government. Then, the third purpose of a budget, according to Alan Schick, is to use the budget for the purpose of planning, to strategically plan the operations of your organization. And if you want to use your budget to help you in terms of planning your operations, the third budget format, a program type of budget, may work well for you. Now, a program type of budget is going to look a lot different than a line item or a performance budget. Line item and performance budgets are organized around departments and units, kind of the way a traditional budget would be. Program-based budgets are organized around the program and program goals, irrespective of which department is contributing to the achievement of those programmatic goals. So let me give you an example. A program budget could focus on a program such as protection of persons and property. That's the program. Then all the activities that contribute to that program goal of protecting persons and property will all be budgeted together underneath that program. Again, irrespective of whether there are things being done by the police department or by the fire department, any activity that contributes to protection of persons and property, those activities all get budgeted together under the program of protection of persons and property. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to reiterate, so essentially the performance budget is measuring how well, if we're allocating money towards this specific thing, how well, like what tangible results is producing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. What we have tangible empirical performance indicators. So if we're spending, $500,000 on this activity, and then ask the question, well, so what? Well, what are we getting from that $500,000? What are we achieving by spending that $5,000 on this activity? So exactly, we have those empirical, tangible types of performance indicators. So a performance budget is going to take you more time to put together because you have to think long and hard about what these tangible indicators are. A program budget is going to take you a lot longer to put together as well. Because when we put a program budget together, we have to understand what activities contribute to what programmatic goals. So one of the strategies, if you will, that we use in creating a program-based budget is a strategy known as crosswalking. Crosswalking is where we'll put a matrix together. And in that matrix, we'll then identify across the top of our matrix in our columns, here are all the program goals that we are trying to accomplish. Then along the left side in our rows, we will then list all the activities. And then we'll just see which activity contributes to which programmatic goal and put a check in that box. That allows us to group all of our activities together that contribute to one specific programmatic goal and budget them all together under that program. So it's a completely different way of putting our budget together, but it allows us to plan how all of our activities are contributing to the achievement of certain programmatic goals. And then the fourth type of budget format is a zero-based budget. This is another format that contributes to the planning goal of a budget. So in a zero-based budget, rather than just taking as assumed what we spent money on last year, we will go back and re-justify why we are spending money on that activity. So we just don't accept, okay, we spent $500,000 on it last year, we'll spend $501,000 on it this year. we go back and ask, is this something we should be spending $500,000 on? And we're not going to get into a lot of the details in zero-based budgeting because it's a very complex budgeting approach. But essentially, what we will do is we'll have different units within our organization that put together what are called decision packages. And each decision package will then offer up different alternatives for how to spend the money and then the consequences of spending the money in that way. So you've got a county library, and that county library has a bookmobile program. So one decision package may say, let's fund this bookmobile program at 90% of what it was funded at last year. If we funded it 90% of last year, it means that we're getting a 10% hit on the amount of money we're spending on this bookmobile. Well, what are the consequences? The consequences means that we're probably not going to be out in the neighborhood as much as we were able to. So maybe we're going to lose 100 hours a year of contact with our patrons, which means that we're going to be able to serve X number fewer patrons. Our circulation rates are going to go down by X percentage. Those are the consequences of taking a 10% cut to this bookmobile. But what if we fund the bookmobile at 10% more than we funded at last year? Well, the consequences of that, we'll be able to serve X number more patrons. We're going to increase our circulation rates by a certain percentage, and so on and so on. It allows us to compare different choices and then the consequences that will accrue for each one of those choices. We rank and prioritize all those different decision packages. The top ranked decision packages then become our budget. However, the problem with zero-based budgeting is it takes a lot of time and effort and it requires a great deal of paperwork. If you're producing maybe 100 decision packages for each one of your decision units in your organization, and each of those decision packages are 50 pages in length, you can do the math and see how you're just creating this mountain of paperwork in putting your budget together. And sometimes we're putting all of our time and resources into putting the budget together as opposed to actually serving the needs of our constituencies. So zero-based budgeting is oftentimes beyond the scope of what local governments are able to do. Usually when we see zero-based budgeting, we tend to see it used at the state level. And when states use zero-based budgeting, they will use what they call a modified approach to zero-based budgeting. And in a modified approach to zero-based budgeting, they will say, we'll take 20% of our budget this year and we'll budget it in a zero-based type of way, but the remaining 80% we'll continue to budget as line item budgeting to save ourselves time and money. Then next year, we'll take a different 20%, subject that to zero-based budgeting, and then do that each year for 5 years. So after 5 years, all aspects of our budget have been subjected to a zero-based budgeting process. But again, when you look at budgets at the local level, you're most of the time going to see a line item budget well over 95% of the time. Sometimes you'll see some local governments adding in some performance indicators and kind of doing a hybrid line item performance-based budget. Program-based budgeting, you're not going to see very much at the local level. Where you are going to see that is sometimes in nonprofit organizations and, strangely enough, at the federal level at the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense since the 1960s has used its own variation of program-based budgeting. And then zero-based budgeting, again, that's where you're going to see mostly at the state level of government. But the format that you use, the way your budget looks, will probably depend upon what you are trying to accomplish with that budget. Are you trying to use it to control, to manage your operations, or to plan the operations of your organization? But up to this point in time, our discussion of public budgets has really looked more at the expenditure side of the equation and how do we handle those expenditures, that money we're spending on an annual basis. Now let's briefly turn our attention to the revenue side of the equation, because before we can spend money, we have to generate that money in terms of revenue. A lot of revenue, as we know, for governments comes in through taxation, tax-based sources of revenue. And the big three tax-based sources of revenue are property, income, and sales taxes. Property taxes are what we call a wealth-based tax. in that we're determining your ability to pay the tax based upon the value of your home, and the assessed value of your home is being used as a surrogate for your wealth. The problem with the property tax is it can be regressive because you may have someone who has a home that has a high assessed valuation, but they're not going to pay their property taxes by selling their home or probably hopefully not refinancing their home, but instead they're going to pay it through their liquid income. And so there's a disconnect between the value of the home and someone's income. You're going to have a what we call a highly regressive type of tax in that you're going to tax people who don't have the ability to pay that tax. The property tax, because we are looking at your wealth in terms of the value of your home, it is what we call an ability to pay tax. So people with more of an ability to pay as measured by the value of their home will pay more in property taxes than people who have less of an ability to pay. The property tax here in California, if you're a homeowner, you know, is governed by Proposition 13. Proposition 13 was a property tax limit that was passed by the voters in 1978. It limits the amount of overall property taxation that a local government can generate. It limits the property tax rate as well as how quickly the value of a home can increase for tax purposes. It is one of the more restrictive property tax limits that we see across the entire country. So it really has pushed a lot of local governments away from relying upon the property tax and pushed them more to relying upon other forms of taxation or even some non-tax sources of revenue. So that's the property tax. The nice thing about the property tax for local governments that do rely upon it is that it tends to be a relatively stable form of taxation, especially with property valuations here in Southern California. The trend in terms of property valuations tends to be overall an upward trend. And as the value of property goes up, then property tax revenue will go up for local governments as well within the parameters of Proposition 13. Second type of tax-based source of revenue is the income tax. The income tax is also an ability to pay tax because your ability to pay the tax is based upon your adjusted gross income. So people who have a higher adjusted gross income will pay a higher percentage of that income in income taxes, at least in theory. We all know that the federal income tax code is very complicated and has so many loopholes in it that sometimes what is designed to be a progressive and fair type of tax actually becomes very regressive. And again, a regressive tax is a tax in which people with less of an ability to pay a higher percentage in taxation. We've all heard the stories of billionaires like Warren Buffett who end up paying maybe 2 or 3% of their income in taxation, as he would say, more than his personal assistant, a higher percentage, a lower percentage than his personal assistant. So he'll pay 2% in federal income taxes. His personal assistant may be paying 22%. Obviously, that's not the way in which the system should be working if it was progressive, but that's the way in which the system currently does work. The income tax is primarily the domain of the federal government. This is where most federal taxes come from, is from the income tax. Also, many state governments, the vast majority of state governments, also rely upon a state income tax. Some states have a local income tax as well. That's something we don't deal with here in California, but some states will allow their cities, their counties, and sometimes even their local school districts access to the income tax. The income tax is usually liked by voters more than the property tax because they see it as being fairer and more progressive in nature. Then the third type of tax is a sales tax. This is not an ability to pay tax, but it is a benefits received type of tax. So you pay the tax based upon the benefit that you receive from purchasing and consuming some type of a commodity. Now, there are two basic types of sales taxes. There is a general sales tax, which will apply to the vast majority of commodities that are transacted in a jurisdiction. And then there is what are known as selective excise taxes. Selective excise taxes will tax commodities differently depending upon the commodity. So, an example of a selective excise tax would be the motor fuels excise tax, what we all lovingly know as the gas tax. The gas tax is applied to the purchase of a gallon of gasoline. It is a benefits received type of tax, a benefit-based type of tax, in that we capture those tax revenues and we use them then for highway construction and repair and road construction. Idea being that when people put gas in their cars, they do so to drive their cars on the roads. That will then cause damage to the roads. We then capture the gas tax revenue and use it for road repair. Another example of a selective excise tax could also be a sin tax. And Brian has a, would cannabis tax fall under this? Absolutely. That's a great example of a selective excise tax. That's what we oftentimes refer to as a sin tax. Sometimes people call it a sumptuary tax. So yes, Brian, that's a great example of a selective excise tax known as a sin tax. With a tax on cannabis products, or a tax on tobacco products, or a tax on alcohol, what we are doing is we are targeting those populations that purchase and consume those types of commodities. The reason why these sumptuary sin taxes are so popular is because of a process known as burden shifting. So if I don't consume tobacco products, then I will not have to pay that tobacco tax. So I am shifting the burden onto people who do consume tobacco products. The more the potential for burden shifting, the more likely it is for it to be a politically appealing tax because people can avoid paying that tax. So those are great examples of selective excise, special types of sales taxes applied differently to different types of commodities. Of the three types of taxes, it's the sales tax that tends to be the most regressive. And that's especially true with a general sales tax. People who have lower income levels tend to have less what we call disposable income. Disposable income is the amount of income that you have left after you have purchased the staples of life. So after you have purchased food and clothing and shelter, then what money you have left over is your disposable income. If the staples of life take up a higher percentage of your income than they do for a wealthier individual, you have less income that is left that is disposable. So if we're taxing people on the staples of life, we are setting them up for a very regressive type of taxation. That's why most states will have what they call commodity-based exemptions. And those commodity-based exemptions will exempt the staples of life from a general sales tax. So we might exempt certain types of foodstuffs from our general sales tax. States like the state of New Jersey used to exempt up to $500 in clothing from the New Jersey sales tax. Those are commodity exemptions to try and take what is a regressive, sometimes unfair form of taxation and make it look a little bit more progressive and a little bit more fair to lower income individuals. But those are just your top three. You'll talk a lot more about this in budgeting. Those are our top three types of tax-based sources of revenue. Again, we have seen a pronounced shift at the local government level away from tax-based sources and shifting more toward non-tax sources of revenue. Things like user charges and user fees. Now, the difference between a user charge and a user fee. A user charge is a charge that is applied to the amount of something that you are consuming. So typically, when you pay a user charge, you are consuming some type of a commodity or you're getting some type of a benefit from consuming something. So you think about something like a utility charge. So you consume a certain amount of utilities and you pay a charge according to the amount of utilities that you are consuming. That is considered to be a user charge. A user fee is a little bit different in that a user fee is not connected to the consumption and the benefit you get from consuming something, but rather fees are usually associated with a license, the privilege of engaging in a certain type of behavior. So you want to go out there and go hunting. You have to purchase a hunting license. You will then pay a fee for that hunting license. You want to drive your car on the road. You pay a registration fee and a license fee for your driver's license. Again, to participate in that type of an activity. The typical city in California now derives more revenue from non-tax sources of revenue as opposed to from the property tax. Now, the caveat there is cities here in Southern California tend to be a little bit different in that your typical Southern California city still generates more revenue from taxes than they tend to do from non-tax sources of revenue. So it really depends upon where the city is located here in California. But after the passage of Proposition 13, we saw a lot of local governments need to move away from the property tax because they no longer could generate revenue from it and then move to the use of more user charges and user fees. But our whole goal here in budgeting and our constitutional mandate is that we need to balance our revenues and our expenditures. An imbalance in revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year is what is known as a deficit. So if you are bringing in less money than you are spending in one fiscal year, then you have what is referred to as a deficit. Technically, the California Constitution does not allow the state or local governments to run an annual deficit. However, there are ways that local governments can get around that. And one of the ways they can get around that is to engage in what's called short-term borrowing. So they go out there and they will borrow money over a short period of time, what are called notes. So they'll issue a note. That note will then generate some revenue over a short period of time that they can then count against their deficit to try and, at least on paper, make that deficit go away. The problem, though, is whenever they go out there and borrow that money, they are doing what we call issuing debt. And that debt must eventually be repaid. So the big difference here between deficits and debts is that deficit is an imbalance of revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year, whereas debts are long term. So a debt is money that we are borrowing over maybe a 20 or 30 or 40-year period of time. That is what we refer to as being long-term debt. And that's one of the issues that you are going to be contending with then on one of those scenarios on your final assessment. And yeah, Jason, that's a good example of the city of LA increasing parking fees to increase revenue. The nice thing about increasing parking fees is it's not a tax. And so everyone in the city doesn't necessarily have to pay it. It's those individuals who are parking that are paying that fee. If they don't want to pay the fee, then they don't park in those locations. And so there's a lot more flexibility with a fee like that as opposed to what you would have in a more broad-based type of tax. So one of the things you're going to be doing on this final assessment in that scenario is dealing with the issue of what type of borrowing should the city be doing to make its renovations to its, I think it was the aquatic center. Whenever governments go out there and borrow money, especially for capital projects, they are doing what we call issuing long-term debt. Long-term debt comes in the form of what we call bonds. So something that's long-term is defined as long-term if the maturity for that debt is more than 1 year in duration. So if we're not going to pay it off within 1 year, it's considered to be long-term. And usually when we borrow long-term, we issue what are called bonds. So a bond is long-term debt. If we're borrowing money over the short term, less than 1 year maturity, that's considered short-term debt, and we refer to short-term debt as being notes. So long-term debt are bonds, short-term debt are considered to be notes. What we are most concerned about here for our final is long-term debt, the issuance of bonds. So the way the process works is a government will issue a bond. When they issue that bond, they will then seek out investors to purchase that bond. They will then use the proceeds you get from those investors purchasing the bond, and those proceeds will then be used to construct your capital project. You will then repay those investors over time with principal and interest payments until you pay off and retire that debt. So that's how we borrow money at the municipal level by the issuance of these things called bonds. We're not going to get into a lot of the details in terms of the mechanisms of how you issue bonds, how you borrow this money. You can talk about that in 555. But for our purposes here, to get you ready for the final assessment, there are different types of bonds that we can issue, different ways in which we can borrow money. One type of bond that is commonly used is what's called a general obligation bond. Sometimes it's called a GO bond. A general obligation bond pledges what's called the full faith and credit of the city to repay that debt. Full faith and credit means that when the city borrows this money, they guarantee the investors, the people who are purchasing this debt, that you will get your money back one way or another. We will use all of our resources at our disposal as a city to repay you this debt. What that means is that those investors have very low risk. They know they're getting the money back from the city. So, with investments, there is this relationship between risk and reward. The higher the risk to the investor, the more reward that investor is going to expect, the more return on their dollar they are going to want. So, since a general obligation bond pledges full faith and credit of the city, it is a very low risk investment for that investor, which means that cities will be charged a low interest rate in order to repay that debt. So, the good thing about a general obligation bond is the interest rates tend to be low with a general obligation bond. So, general obligation bonds will save governments money whenever they issue this debt. That's the advantage of a general obligation bond. The disadvantage of a general obligation bond is even though they are cheaper to issue, you oftentimes have to get voter approval. And for certain general obligation bonds, it means you have to go out there and get a two-thirds voter approval. So two-thirds of your voters need to vote yes in order for you to issue this general obligation debt. Now, there are some exceptions to that. One is for school districts. So if you're issuing a general obligation debt as a school district, a general obligation bond, you may only have to get 55% voter approval. Now, that's a provision from Proposition 39. But in order to be able to issue a Proposition 39 general obligation bond and only have to get 55% voter approval, you also have to establish a citizen oversight committee. And that citizen oversight committee will then oversee how this general obligation money is being spent. But that's a general obligation bond. To the disadvantages, you have to get voter approval. The other disadvantage is that states will impose limitations on the amount of general obligation debt that a local government can issue. So if you are bumping up against your general obligation debt ceiling, you may not have the availability to be able to issue general obligation debt. A second type of bond that you could choose is what's known as a revenue bond. Now, revenue bonds are different in that the repayment for a revenue bond will be secured not from full faith and credit, but rather will be secured from the revenue that is generated from operating the facility. So if you're going to issue a revenue bond to build a recreation center, then you will capture the revenue generated by this recreation center and use that revenue to then repay that revenue bond. The problem, though, with the revenue bond is number one, it's more expensive because with a revenue bond, there's more risk to the investor. If this recreation center goes belly up and it doesn't stay in business, then that's the stream of revenue for that investor. So that recreation center goes out of business, that investor does not get their investment back. So there's a lot more risk involved, which means they're going to require more of a return. So the interest rates that governments pay with revenue bonds are far higher than what they would pay with a general obligation bond. The advantage of a revenue bond is because you are only securing the repayment with the revenue from this recreation center, there's less risk for the city because you're not saying we're going to use all of our resources to repay this debt. The investor knows if the recreation center doesn't work out, then you're off the hook of repaying the debt. So there's less risk then for the city. Another advantage of a revenue bond is revenue bonds oftentimes do not count against general obligation limitations. So if you don't have enough capacity, as we call it, to issue a general obligation bond, you may be able to then issue a revenue bond. These revenue bonds oftentimes also do not require voter approval, so it gives you a little bit more flexibility. But if you're going to issue a revenue bond, you need to be very certain that the revenue that's coming from this recreation center is enough to cover both the operating costs on an annual basis of that recreation center, as well as your debt service, repaying the debt. If you are not raising enough money to operate the center and repay the debt, then a revenue bond simply will not work. A third option is what's called a double barrel bond. A double barrel bond is what it sounds like. It combines general obligation and revenue together. So it may say 70% of this bond will be general obligation secured by the full faith and credit of the city. 30% will be revenue secured by only the revenue generated by the operation of this facility. Whereas general obligation bonds have the lowest interest rates, revenue bonds have the highest interest rate, double barrel bond interest rates fall right in the middle. So it's kind of a middling type of approach between general obligation and revenue bonds. But the idea behind these bonds is that if you were going to go out there and build a $100 million recreation center and you had to increase your tax rate to a sufficient level to generate $100 million in year number one, that's going to be cost prohibitive for your citizens. So instead, what you do is you issue debt. You then repay that debt over time, 20 or 30 or 40 years. So the tax increase is much lower to your residents because that tax increase is going to be spread out across a 30-year period. So it makes it more affordable for your residents. Secondly, is what we know, a principle we know as intergenerational equity. I'm going to try and type this and talk. Intergenerational equity. Intergenerational equity says if you're going to build this recreation center that you hope will last for 50 years, citizens in your city are going to benefit from this center for the next 50 years. So, therefore, is it really fair for people who live in the city in year one to bear the entire burden of paying for this recreation center? Isn't it more fair to spread the burden out over future generations who will also be getting a benefit from using this recreation center? And that intergenerational equity, along with the practical arguments, really explains a lot of this long term borrowing that we see governments doing. So, again, on that scenario, you're going to, for those renovations for the aquatic center, you're going to have to select a general obligation, revenue, or double barrel bond, and which one of those would be most appropriate for that situation and why. When you get to 555, you'll talk a lot more about borrowing money. You'll talk about credit rating agencies. In order to get a good rate on the bond that you are issuing, you need to have a good credit rating. And just like we have credit rating agencies in our private lives, we also have credit rating agencies for governments. Standard and Poor's, Moody's, Fitch's are three of the main credit rating agencies. Whenever a city decides to issue a bond to borrow money, they have to contract with one of these credit rating agencies to issue a bond rating. Those credit rating agencies will look at the bond, will look at the fiscal conditions of the city, and they will then assign a credit rating or a bond rating to that bond. The better the rating you get on that bond, the lower the interest you'll have to pay to repay that debt. So it really does benefit governments to keep their fiscal books in order and to be fiscally healthy so that when they do borrow money, they can do so cheaper by getting a better bond rating from one of these credit rating agencies. So a lot of what we've talked about since our break has really looked at the budgets, the different types of budgets there are, the process of budgeting, and how governments go through this process of budgeting and finance. We know that the budgeting process is very difficult to control, and that's especially true at the federal level. Like we said, the federal government rarely gets its budget done on time and rarely is able to avoid a deficit. Since 1969, the federal government has only run a surplus two out of those years since 1969. It's only twice over all those decades. And we very rarely, if ever, get the budget done on time. Because of those two main problems, not getting the budget done on time and not being able to balance revenues and expenditures, We have had many attempts to try and reform the federal budgeting process. Won't go through all the details here because of our limited time, but the first one you see there, the Budget Impoundment Control Act from the 1970s. The purpose of that was Congress's attempt to try and control the process. So Congress did things to try and limit the power of the president over the budgeting process. They created a congressional budget office to provide them with information in the budgeting process to try and balance the information the president gets from the Office of Management and Budget. They try and put curbs and limitations on the president's ability to refuse to spend appropriations, like we have seen twice so far here in the Trump administration. So much so that if a president wanted to rescind funds and refuse to spend money, they would have to put a list of those projects together and then go back to Congress and have Congress approve that list. We saw President Trump do that once back in July. The last time he rescinded funds, he did not do that. And Congress just kind of let the issue go. So that is technically a violation of this 1970s law, but if Congress doesn't push it, the president certainly is going to let it go as well. So Congress tried to assert its power over the process in the 1970s. It didn't work. By the time we got in the 1980s, the process was still out of control. Budgets were not getting done on time, and we still had deficits. So in the 1980s, we had a series of a couple different pieces of legislation called Grand-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2 to try and eliminate deficits. It set up timetables by which every year we would have a maximum deficit target. If we did not meet that maximum deficit target, we would do across the board cuts in spending until we got down to that target. Problem was, Congress had the legislative ability to just change those targets. So the politically easy thing to do was, instead of doing across the board cuts, just increase the target. So we never actually got down to zero with our budget deficits. In fact, budget deficits continued to increase. So in the 1990s, we got this thing called the Budget Enforcement Act. And we decided if we were going to impose discipline on the budgeting process, and if we were going to eliminate deficits, the only way to do that was through limiting spending. So the Budget Enforcement Act, we created three different categories of spending, and we created what we call firewalls between them. So if you wanted to spend more money on a domestic program, you could not rob from international to pay for domestic. You could not rob from domestic to pay for defense. And we also introduced this thing that we still use in the Senate today, or try to, this process known as PAYGO. PAYGO stands for pay as you go, a really revolutionary concept that if you want to spend more money, you got to pay for it. So for every dollar additional you want to spend, you have to find cuts in other programs to equal that dollar. You can't say we're going to spend a dollar more and then go out there and borrow that money. You have to pay for things as you go. The combination of those improvements from the Budget Enforcement Act, along with a very quickly growing economy in the mid 1990s, the dot-com boom in the Silicon Valley was bringing in a ton of additional revenue from the internet and coming into federal government coffers. Whenever you have an explosion in revenue and a reduction in spending, guess what? You eliminate deficits. And we eliminate deficits at the end of the 1990s. Then we had the terrorist attacks on September 11th, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and we were right back into deficit spending again. So what is the moral of the story? The moral of the story in public budgeting is, if we want to control the budgeting process, and if we want to not spend more than we are raising in revenue, it is not a matter of procedural changes, but rather it is a matter of political willpower. If budget makers don't have the political willpower to make the difficult decisions in terms of raising revenue or limiting spending, we are never going to have a federal budget process that is under control. I think that picture of somebody with open pockets is very true at the federal level. Here in the state of California, our May revise last year was a little bit better than we may have thought it would be. The word coming out of Sacramento today is that as of the early March, where we are now, receipts are actually larger than our forecasts were. So when we get to this year's May revise may actually look pretty good. in that we're generating more revenue than we thought we were going to be generating. So hopefully, fingers crossed, in a couple of months, we will have a very good May revise, and a lot of the money that we had lost several years ago in the budget may actually be coming back to us. It just shows you how dynamic the budgeting world really is and how we put budgets together. The results of those budgets will really depend upon the situation in which we find ourselves. Just like everything else, managing of fiscal resources depends. It depends upon the current situation. Hence the reason my favorite answer to everything is it depends. That then wraps up all the information we typically cover here in PPA 500, and we've done it about 30 seconds early, so nothing like landing the plane on time. Any last second questions or clarifications on any of this information? My goal was to give you more than 30 seconds to ask questions, but I really want to get through all the information that's covered on the final exam to make sure we had covered it all so that you'll have all the information you need to do all 5 of those scenarios. That final assessment then is the last thing due in this class. It is due again next Tuesday by midnight. As you're working on that final assessment, if you have any questions at all, feel free to send me an email. I'll be available to answer any of those questions. Everyone did a really great job on the midterm assessment, so use the same approach you use on the midterm to here on the final assessment, and everything will go well, and everyone will do just as well on their final as they did on the midterm. Fingers crossed, hopefully. We are completely out of time. Thank you, everyone, for the past 7 weeks. It's been a pleasure working with you. I'll have this recording up on our Canvas site by tomorrow morning. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all on any of this information or on the final assessment. Otherwise, no, we won't have to have a class next Tuesday, but I look forward to reading your final assessments. We'll get those turned around to you as quickly as possible and hopefully get all your final grades done then by next Friday. Thanks, everyone. Have a great remainder of the week and have a great remainder of the semester. And, welcome to the MPA program. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I think you will. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Professor.
Professor.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.